What has surprised me in the recent months is a number of really prominent universities have reinstituted the SAT.
A score that to me felt humiliating, actually, given my context, looked pretty good.
I'd say 75-80% of the denied students that I've read had perfect test scores.
I really think there needs to be an emphasis on what the contributions are that these young people are going to make.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, who deserves to go to college, and how should we decide that?
When I was in high school, my life was totally in shambles. My mom was struggling with compulsive shopping and hoarding, which meant that our home was just filled with waist-high piles of trash, mice running between them. We often didn't have hot water, couldn't shower, and I was realizing, college is potentially my way out.
For Emmy Neatfield, not just any university would do, though. Her heart was set on an Ivy League school, far away from her dysfunctional home. But her academic record wasn't up to snuff.
I have so many strikes against me in terms of having a messy transcript, having changed schools a lot of times, having a complicated family background. In order to compensate for that, I need to have a really, really good test score. I need to have a better score than the prep school kids from 2-parent families. I did not have the power to take an advanced placement class. Really, the only thing that I knew I could do was study for these standardized tests.
So Neatfield is the rare college applicant counting on the SAT to boost her chances of a plum admission. And luckily, she was applying at a time, a decade ago, when all universities still required a standardized test score. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, that has completely changed, to the relief of most college hopefuls who tend to dread the SAT, or ACT, as a hurdle more than a help. If Neatfield hadn't been required to send in her score years ago, though, she suspects her story would have been different.
I think that there's a really good chance that I just would not have submitted it to Harvard or to some of the other schools, and because of that, might not have gotten in.
Now, whatever you think about the value of a college education, it is still the most reliable way to get ahead in America's economy. And though 90% of college students did not go to a highly selective school like Harvard, I sure didn't, those who do make up a disproportionate percentage of the top echelon in our society. They're CEOs, law partners, congressional staffers and lobbyists, Supreme Court justices, and so on. And in just the last few years, the process to award those elite university spots has been turned on its ear. For a whole century, the ACT and SAT played a central role in filtering prospective college students. But a temporary pause to that requirement during the pandemic has now turned into a permanent shift across higher education. And a lot of people think that's for the better, particularly since these tests have long been shown to disadvantage students of color and those with fewer economic resources. But now, a growing number of elite schools, including Harvard, MIT, and Dartmouth, are reinstating their test requirement. Why are they struggling to make up their minds? Meanwhile, the Supreme Court outlawed another prominent filter that elite schools have used to make admissions decisions: race. So, today on Top of Mind, with affirmative action out and test requirements in flux, how do we decide who deserves the most coveted college degrees? Just a few weeks before Harvard announced it would start requiring SAT scores again, Emmy Neatfield published an opinion in the New York Times titled, "How the SAT Changed My Life."
I think it was really important to signal to colleges that I was academically ready.
The test's role in her own life has a prominent place in her book, Acceptance, a Memoir. And she thinks elite universities should require the SAT.
For the Ivy League schools, and for certain elite colleges, it makes a lot of sense. If you're coming from a school in the middle of nowhere that has never sent somebody to Harvard, how are they supposed to know that you're qualified or not?
Neatfield grew up in Minnesota, in and out of therapy, dealing with family trauma and mental illness. She ended up in a psych ward at the age of 13, and then spent her freshman year of high school in a locked residential treatment center with little academic rigor.
They had an on-site classroom, and we did multiplication worksheets. You would just be given a textbook and told, okay, teach yourself some math. So I was very aware that every day that I spent there, I was falling behind academically. But every 3 weeks, there was a trip to the public library. And we were allowed to check out 3 books. And for my first couple of months in this place, I was not allowed to go outside. Like, not at all. I did not feel fresh air for several months. But I was able to, write on a tiny piece of paper, here is my library book request. And I was like, SAT book.
So what were you able to do with that as a 14-year-old locked up in this facility?
We had hours every single day of what was euphemistically called quiet time, where we just had to sit in our rooms, which were basically empty, except for like a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe, all bolted to the wall and to the floor. And those were the times that I studied. And I had a little composition book, and in it I would, take the practice test and I would write down my answers in my little tiny pencil and then try to get better every day. And I realized from taking this test that I had not learned most of the material, and I was not on track to learn most of the material. But luckily, the book, it talked you through, like, here is how you calculate the length of the side of a triangle.
Oh.
And that was not something that I was going to get in school. Nobody was going to notice that I didn't know how to calculate that. But because I had this book, I had this way to basically teach myself everything that I had missed.
Did you enjoy that? Was it, how did you feel about what you were doing?
It felt like the one time of the day that I had control. Most of the time, I just had to do whatever these adults told me to do, even if I thought it was misguided and dumb. But in that time, I had agency, and I was doing something that I actually believed could lead me to a better life.
So by the time junior year rolled around, Emmy Neatfield had been in foster care, and eventually she landed in a private boarding school on a scholarship. But it was too late to rehab her academic record.
And so I ended up taking the SAT in the spring of my junior year, and I thought, okay, this is just the first time. I'll try to take it again. They had a fee waiver program. But little did I know that when I sat down with that bubble sheet, that was it. That was going to be my one shot.
So, forgive me for being so forward, but what did you get on the SAT?
Well, when I took the SAT, it was out of 2,400. And so I got a 2170 out of 2,400.
It's a good score in the 95th percentile, but Neatfield was not happy with it.
Almost as soon as I got that score, I thought, I have to retake this test.
Because she had her heart set on the Ivy League.
And I just was so hopeful that if I can get into this top college, things will transform for me immediately. And I will be catapulted out of this difficult situation and into a much easier life and a much easier future.
Why did you remain so committed to an Ivy League school when even a state school could have been your exit?
That's a great question. I think that the University of Minnesota is an amazing school. And also the University of Minnesota was like a mile from my mom. And the University of Wisconsin, which offered reciprocal tuition, was like several hours from my mom. And I really had this sense of I have to get as far away as possible. And I also was getting these flyers that told me about their financial aid programs. And so I knew, okay, if I get into a Harvard or a Yale, I probably won't have to pay anything. It'll be a completely free ride, tuition, room and board, versus if I go to a state school, yes, the sticker price is a lot cheaper, but I'm probably going to be tens of thousands of dollars in debt by the time I graduate.
Neatfield never got to try for a better SAT score, though, because she spent the summer after her junior year homeless. The dorms at her boarding school were closed for the summer.
My foster care file had been closed. My mom's house was really worse than ever. And I was like, sleeping on a friend's sofa and then going to the public library, or trying to write essays in my journal while I was sleeping in my car. And it was not going well for me. I was so focused on survival that at that point I was not going to have any extra time to be studying for this test or retaking this test.
Then a lifeline. A high-profile college admissions coach agreed to take Neatfield on for free.
And what she explained to me is that what was really going to make the difference was explaining to colleges my circumstances. My job was to communicate this very complicated story to colleges.
When Neatfield heard back from Harvard, she was on a computer at the public library.
I clicked on the email and I just saw the word congratulations. And I started screaming. I irritated at least 200 library patrons and many librarians, but I couldn't. It was completely involuntary. I couldn't help it. And I ran out as fast as I could so that I could go out and scream outside and dance in the rain and jump up and down. And I just knew, okay, my life has changed forever. And I was honestly just so grateful that I had been able to do this studying and get through this place to this just unthinkable outcome where who could have predicted that when I was locked up on antipsychotics, not going to school, that I would ever be able to get into Harvard 3.5 years later. I had been thinking about the SATs and the ACTs, as many people do, where colleges are just lining up people based on their score, and they're going to take the people who have the 800s on every subject, and that's really how they're using it, right? As this really objective number that doesn't take into account any circumstances. But in hindsight, that is really not how these ultra elite schools are using this test. And so a score that to me felt humiliating, actually given my context, looked pretty good. But I think that it showed I had potential and that I had kind of the basic skills that I would need to do okay at Harvard.
Was Harvard the right place for you? Did you thrive?
Harvard is a very complicated place. I have a very complicated relationship with Harvard. I was 3 or 4 years into college when it first occurred to me, oh, maybe I would have been happier at some other school, right? Maybe I would have had a more fun experience. But that was not really the main consideration on my mind, right? My concerns were very practical, how am I going to get a job with dental insurance? And for me, Harvard was the perfect place to make that happen. So it didn't immediately change everything in the way that I hoped, but by the time I graduated, my life was totally, totally different. And I did graduate with a full-time job to work at Google as a software engineer, which was, enough money that I could make a nest egg and save for myself. And I feel really, really grateful that I was basically able to get my way into a life that's completely unrecognizable from the life that I grew up with.
Emmy Neatfield is a journalist. She's author of the memoir Acceptance, a memoir. Thank you so much for taking time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Emmy Neatfield graduated from Harvard in 2015. As elite universities reinstate test requirements for applicants, they point to stories like Neatfield's, where the SAT can help them uncover diamonds in the rough. which is kind of ironic since most college hopefuls see the SAT as a barrier to entry. But when Dartmouth announced in early 2024 that it would be the first Ivy to bring back the SAT, the school said that its test-optional stance over the previous few years had led hundreds of low-income and first-generation students to not submit test scores that could have helped them get in. And that, in a surprising way, actually aligns with the origins of the SAT. Back when elite schools first embraced it, in the early 1900s, they were not using it to filter students out. They were thinking,
we're going to look for a few people out there who are extremely smart and have the capability of being top-level academics, but wouldn't ordinarily be on the path to go to, like, Ivy League schools.
Next up, the history of how universities fell in and then out of love with the SAT. I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. Hey, it's Julie. There is another podcast I think you're going to like from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, so I wanted to pass along the word. It's called In Good Faith. Join host Stephen Cat-Perry as he connects with believers from various religions, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, and much, much more. Listening to their captivating stories is an opportunity to deepen our own understanding of faith, religion, and spirituality. Plus, Stephen is really well-traveled, and his global perspective brings a unique richness to each conversation. Elevate your appreciation for the divine with In Good Faith. It's an inspiring journey of unity and enlightenment. Listen anywhere you get podcasts. All right, so I, like most Americans, did not go to a hyper-selective university. And as I watched this whole SAT, ACT saga play out in the news over the last couple of years, I really had to wonder if it was much ado about nothing.
There's a culture around the SAT that is built up over the years that's very psychologically powerful.
I spoke with Professor Nicholas Lemon from his office at the Columbia School of Journalism. He wrote an influential book back in the late 90s called The Big Test, The Secret History of the American Meritocracy.
Most people who take the SAT are going to go to a college that is not one of the super highly selective colleges. And so rationally, the SAT score they get does not absolutely determine where they will go to college, but it gets your attention. So many people take it, they remember their scores. There's a feeling out there that it's a test of how smart you are and that it does affect where you go to college. And when you see all the different college ratings and guides to college and so on, they always list average SAT scores and ACT scores. So it's just sort of embedded in your mind that this matters a lot.
There's also this.
There's a perception out there, which I think is largely true, that if you're selected for one of these highly selective handful of universities, it sort of puts you on a track and gives you a start over the average person. The SAT is related to, at least, which 3%, 5%, 6% of applicants are going to get those precious places and be sort of put on the road for some kind of special success. And it was because it started at the Ivies, it was sort of prestigious. It had some of that Ivy prestige. And a lot of state schools wanted that too. And a lot of the faculties at those schools got their PhDs at the Ivy schools and just felt like a way to bring in that culture and those values.
But to understand the original purpose of the SAT, we need to go back to World War I, which is around the time the test was invented. There was also a lot of energy around IQ tests then.
They had these enthusiasts who were trying to promote them in the United States. So the enthusiasts persuaded the Army, U.S. Army, during the First World War to administer IQ tests to all people being inducted into the Army. This was more to just show that it could be administered to a large group of people at the same time and then be used to assess that population.
Enter Carl Brigham.
So Brigham was a young psychologist during the First World War, and he was what's called a psychometrician. That's a psychologist who invents tests to measure, various kinds of mental capacities. Brigham was an enthusiastic member of something called the eugenics movement. They believed that race was a sort of biological factor that determined how well you would do in life, and that there were superior and inferior races. And he wrote a book about the Army tests, which basically, kind of laid out these tests show that X race is superior to Y race is superior to Z race. And Brigham, to his credit, was almost the only one of the leading eugenicists who renounced his views later. So he should get a lot of credit for that. But before he had renounced, he became a professor at Princeton, and he decided to invent a special version of these Army tests to be used in college admissions, and that was the SAT. It's called Scholastic Aptitude Test, and the first experimental administration was in 1926.
A few years later, Harvard became the first university to use the SAT. At the time, it was just to select students for a special scholarship program.
Something called the Harvard National Scholarship Program. And these would be people largely from public school, not private school, and maybe not just from the Northeast.
Now, this was a huge change to the way top colleges typically found students.
Previously, the U.S. used to be kind of an aristocracy. That is, the prizes would go to people of fortunate birth. This was in the long ago days when elite educational institutions were dominated by fraternities and speakeasies and people wearing raccoon coats, like an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. They were not particularly academic, and they tended to be populated by rich kids. So what that meant was that universities had a kind of open audition system where they kind of take everybody or almost everybody and then just see who would cut the mustard once they got there. And so there was a dream that was taking form of, well, we could take these universities and, make them more academic institutions. It was the idea of making these into real grown-up research universities with real faculty and students who looked like miniature versions of the faculty and were chosen for their outstanding academic ability rather than whatever else. So the whole country was being scanned for the most deserving, and then those people would be taken to the most selective colleges and slotted for leadership positions. And this would be a big change in the nature of at least who got to be leaders in the United States.
But it wasn't long before the rich and privileged figured out how to gain an advantage in this new system of merit.
If you think of it as kind of a fable, and you say, I define merit as having unusually big ears, okay? So from now on, we're going to select who gets to go to Harvard and Yale on the basis of who has the biggest ears. In some way that I don't totally understand, the people who are doing better in life would figure out how to have children with bigger ears. They just would. That's the way the world works. And so if you invent a system that's meant to upend inherited advantage and it sort of bakes in and runs for a couple of generations, it'll turn out to reward advantage instead of upending it.
Because the people with advantage will find a way to make sure that they do particularly well on that.
Yeah, exactly. They groom their kids to be great on that criterion.
By the late 1950s, the SAT was a widespread requirement in American higher education. The ACT was invented to compete with it. And the GI Bill, plus a booming middle class, brought an influx of applicants, too. So colleges needed a way to winnow applications. And the SAT was ready for its star turn. Now, universities never explicitly said, you need this score or higher to get in, says Lemon.
But, the truth is there's de facto score levels you need to get into highly selective colleges. It's like an early version of AI or something that you don't have to interview every applicant and read every application folder. And more, what I was talking about a few minutes ago took hold, which is the idea that universities should select on the basis of academic potential primarily, and not things like, quote, character and, quote, leadership ability. So the combination of those two things led to the system where there are many, many, many more applicants than places. There has to be some way of handing out the places, and the SAT became more important. One thing I want to say is that, the SAT is a product of the kind of liberal establishment, right? The liberal establishment at the time the SAT system was being put into place was overwhelmingly white male, almost completely white male. And one thing that was interesting as you look back is how little these people thought about race at all. And then when the SAT came in, they didn't become any less white. So then the 1960s come along, and all of a sudden these institutions that had been weirdly unaware of race, or at least consciously, sort of woke up and said, whoa, wait a minute, we are 1% Black or something like that in a country that's like 15% Black, and we're in the middle of the civil rights movement, et cetera, and we've got to do something to integrate ourselves.
So universities started using race as a factor in admissions, and affirmative action was born. At the same time, though, colleges had become so married to the SAT or ACT in their admission systems, they had a problem, says Lemon.
Those two things don't naturally fit. If you just want to admit by the SAT, full stop, you're going to get a class that is overwhelmingly white, living in the coasts more disproportionately, and upper middle class. If at the same time you say, no, we're not that school anymore, then the SAT is not your friend in achieving that. And there's a lot of mythology about this that I think you should take with a grain of salt, that the SAT is the only way to find so-called diamonds in the rough, who, are poor kids and kids of color in obscure, disadvantaged backgrounds, but get fabulous SAT scores, because there just aren't a large number of those kids in this country.
So the stories that we're hearing from people of color or people who came from really disadvantaged, chaotic backgrounds, who had maybe poor transcripts but did well enough on the SAT to get into Harvard, you're saying that exists, but it's also a small...
They're anecdotes. They're anecdotes.
Okay.
So, with all the best will in the world, the universities started saying, well, we want to integrate ourselves. They did integrate themselves. And they did that partly by de-emphasizing the SAT to some extent. It did not take long for that to come back to bite them, in the sense that by the early 70s, 50 years ago, people were starting to file lawsuits against universities saying, hey, I'm a white guy and a Black guy who was less qualified than me got in instead of me, and I can prove it because I got a higher LSAT score or MCAT score or SAT score than this accepted applicant did, and so I'm being discriminated against on the basis of my race. So there's a whole series of these cases over half a century, kind of culminating in these two cases from 2023, one from Harvard and one from the University of North Carolina, where the Supreme Court, after making a long series of very fine-grained decisions where it had a real problem making up its mind, finally said, sorry, you cannot explicitly take race into account in making admissions decisions anymore.
Now, at that point, Lemon thought colleges had a choice to make. Either they get rid of the SAT and ACT, which favor white applicants, or they de-emphasize racial diversity in their admissions goals. Lemon predicted colleges would opt to eliminate the test.
Officially, hundreds of universities went test optional because of COVID. And that may be part of the story, but I think a lot of the story was them anticipating the Supreme Court decision and saying, the Supreme Court decision, when it comes down, given who's on the court now, is going to force us to drop affirmative action. And therefore, if we keep SATs, we're going to have significant drops in our minority populations. And what has surprised me in the recent months is a number of really prominent universities have reinstituted the SAT. And most of what we've seen over years of back and forth around this has been that reinstituting tests and abolishing affirmative action or any kind of racial preference leads to reduced Black and Latino percentages.
And so what do you think when universities are saying, we look at the whole student and a test score is one data point, as is their transcript, as are their essays?
Yeah, so that's all true, but the problem is the vulnerability to lawsuits. Because if the data exists, a white student who's rejected can sue and say, I was discriminated against racially because I can prove that people, if they can prove it, that people who have lower test scores than I do were admitted and I was rejected. And that's a part of the picture you can't take out because there have been so many over the years and there'll be more to come.
Nicholas Lemon is a professor at the Columbia School of Journalism, and his new book is Higher Admissions: The Rise, Decline, and Return of Standardized Testing. So given that risk, why are elite colleges bringing back test requirements?
If you can be the university that says, hey, among all these schools, we still hold these particular standards of excellence, it's competitive advantage at the end of the day.
Coming up on Top of Mind, a look at the real role that tests and race play in admissions from somebody who's been on the inside. I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. Hey folks, it's Julie. Can I recommend quickly another podcast I think you're really going to dig? It's called A Braver Way with Monica Guzman, and it's from our friends at Braver Angels. You've heard Monica on Top of Mind before, talking about how to engage with perspectives you really disagree with. And each episode of her podcast, A Braver Way, introduces us to people from across the political spectrum who are taking the toxicity out of our politics, not by watering down their convictions, but by letting them clash and come into conversation. I know, it sounds impossible, but every episode of A Braver Way surprises me. And the goal for their current season, which I love, is to help us face this election year without losing heart. So check out A Braver Way at braverangels.org/abraverway or by searching for A Braver Way in your favorite podcast app. Now, back to Top of Mind. Alex Coupe was an admissions officer at Stanford and at the University of Chicago, and he's not surprised to see elite schools reinstating the test requirement.
If you're a school that really adheres to tradition, and this has always been a selling point for you, appeal to folks who do want to say, hey, here's another level of prestige that my student has gotten into.
In other words, it's about status. When Coupe was working in admissions about a decade ago, the landscape was different. All elite schools required an SAT or ACT score. Affirmative action was still legal. And his goal as an admissions officer was to help kids like him, a Black public school student from Chicago with decent grades, good test scores, and passionate interests. For him, that was writing.
I was completely obsessed with LiveJournal. It was one of the first just online journals for high school students. I had a public one. I would write in it every single day. But with my grades, I doubt I would have had, a really wonderful chance at being admitted at Pomona if it weren't for the scholarship.
Pomona is a private college in California that accepts only 7% of applicants. And Coupe got in on a scholarship that recruits students from disadvantaged backgrounds.
It really opened a tremendous amount of doors. Needless to say, it was an adjustment process moving from the south side of Chicago to, sunny Southern California. And I really felt, maybe some imposter syndrome, not having been the brightest high school student. But I really learned that there are many different types of intelligences. And that must mean that now that I have a college degree, there must be plenty of students like me who didn't think that, getting into a highly selective school was even a possibility. If I can work to help them be successful, I'm going to absolutely do that.
So what surprised you when you went through your first selection cycle as an admissions officer?
Sure. The first admission cycle that I went through, I think what surprised me most was just the sheer quantity of students getting denied. I would see students who would have been valedictorian at my high school or would have been, on paper, the smartest person I had ever encountered in Chicago, and it was just a flat deny.
The average acceptance rate to an Ivy League school can be as low as 3% and typically no higher than 10%. These schools get tens of thousands of applications each cycle. Coupe says the further from perfect your SAT or ACT score is, the harder it'll be to get in. And even if you do get that perfect score,
I'd say 75, 80% of the denied students that I've read had perfect test scores, right? So 1,600 SAT, 36 ACT, whatever it might be, right? And you're still seeing students get weeded out in the first round despite demonstrating absolute academic excellence. And this was 10 years ago at this point, so it's only gotten more competitive.
here's how it typically played out.
There's a first reader for a territory, so you read all the applications first from a particular area. So let's say students from Oklahoma are applying to Harvard. There'd be one person who reads all the apps from Oklahoma. To some extent, context is considered, like, oh, well, this student went to a public school, or, hey, the socioeconomic level of this area means that unlike most of this applicant pool, this family might not have been able to afford a testing tutor, you know? But it really is left up to the admissions officer to make the call. That person, if they like the applications, will send them over to a second reader who then provides a shorter evaluation, right? And then all those applications go to something called committee, where a group of admissions officers vote on who they want to be admitted.
Right. So that first round, then it's like, this is your group. And then you kind of, I don't know what, like go into the Thunderdome with the other admissions officers and you're like, these are my folks over here and they're the ones I'm going to fight for. I mean, is it your job to advocate for them then when you go into that next round?
Yeah, lawyer, I think is kind of the analogy that I would make there. You know, you bring your students and everyone has their own biases, and it's kind of known amongst the office who has which biases. I studied philosophy. I brought a lot of philosophy kids. I brought a lot of self-aware kids who, you know, were writers and who I frankly just saw myself in. But I think the magic of it is when you have a group of folks who have their own biases, you know, which everyone knows, then you can come to some kind of consensus. Certainly not an objective one. But in committee, yes, it's your job to say, hey, I think this student should be admitted. Here are the numbers. Here's maybe some quotes from the essays. Here's, you know, when they took AP scores and how they did. Here's a blip that happened sophomore year, but the counselor at the school explained it this way. And yeah, you're making a case for the student to be admitted.
How often did you bring a student to the committee that actually had less than perfect test scores? Like, it seems like that would just make your job automatically harder. And if your incentive is to try to get your students through the committee, you know, like, why would you even pick a student who has less than a perfect score on the SAT?
That's the right question. And there's perfect and close to perfect are relevant, you know, for admission in the conversation, right? So if you look at the average ACT or SAT of these places, you'll see 1520 or 1540, not necessarily 1600, right? So you can bring students on the margin of perfection in that way. But you can also be really strategic, right? If you know you want X student to be admitted and it's going to be a tough case for everyone, then the student right before that student, you should make sure that everyone's going to deny that student, right? Everyone feels bad for denying two students in a row. So that way the student that you actually wanted to get in maybe has a better chance. It's a human process, so you can use every advantage that you can to make it happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know what to say, Alex, other than that it just, I mean, if I were a student trying to get into this selective school, I would have this huge amount of hope that I could be the one that would get your attention. But then also I would feel like, I mean, there's nothing I can do because it feels so arbitrary and so like, I mean, you know, you might have had a headache the day that you were reading my essay, you know, you might have not slept well the night before, or I don't, you know, maybe there was one other student that you read right before me that you actually really liked. And so that biased how you thought about me. I mean,
100%. Yeah. Or it's 3:30 a.m., you know, and I'm really hungry, right? Those things I think play a really small factor in the process, and you can't ignore that. But yeah, there is, I think that's the one case I would make for the ACT or SAT is that regardless of how sleepy an admissions officer is, the number's the number, right? It sells itself in that way to a committee if you've done well. And I mean, on the other coin, that's a disadvantage to a student who hasn't, right? So I do think having some metrics that feign objectivity, you know, might be an important part of the process, but certainly it shouldn't be the end-all, be-all.
Would your job have been harder or easier without that SAT score? or ACT score?
Sure. I think that's a really great question because it depends on what the job is, right? I would say for me, it would have been easier without it because most of the students who I might have advocated for, because of maybe personal biases, I'm trying to get students who the pool maybe inherently isn't looking for. So yeah, I would prefer it if those types of metrics didn't exist, especially because of the people that they've historically excluded.
How often would you come across a student who didn't have all of those additional resources behind them, who also had a near perfect SAT score? And did that feel like like you would just hit the jackpot with a student like that?
Yeah, that's very rare. Even you asking that question, I get a chill, or I got a chill, in those moments where you just meet someone who's a rock star. You almost don't have to sell the context. It's like, no, they're awesome, and right. They're doing it against all odds. It's a beautiful story. It usually gets, all yes votes. And yeah, that's kind of why you do the work. It's even more rewarding when the student is borderline or when you have to really make the case and really, do your homework to point out the excellences. Not just your homework on the application, but your homework on the committee, right? So, hey, I don't know, Martin's on this committee and Martin's a math guy. So let me make sure that I mention that this student took calculus over the summer before senior year to get a year ahead in math, even though they're an English major. That'll really get Martin, right? And that's the kind of lawyer aspect of it is, choosing a jury in that sense. It's chosen for you, but making sure that you have selling points for the committee.
And to be clear, this was 10 years ago when affirmative action was still a legal and accepted policy at many selective colleges around the country. And so it was okay for you to be saying, we'd like to admit more Black students, and here's a Black student that I think really meets the qualifications.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I can only imagine, and talking to my friends who are still in the admissions field, the amount of work you have to do to say, hey, yes, it's not just about race, but race is correlated with all these other things. It's really tough to quantify having a difficult racial experience or being one Black kid and a student, in a classroom and what that experience is like. And the types of intelligences you need to deal with that, they don't translate to paper very well, right? So with affirmative action removed in that sense, it becomes a real creative challenge for folks who are really trying to admit equitable pools, I would say.
By the time the pandemic started, Alex Coupe had left the admissions office and was working as a private coach for college applicants with a company called Empowerly. As universities began going test optional, and in some cases test blind, where they wouldn't even look at a score if you submitted it, Coupe was thinking,
it's not going to make a tremendous difference in the long run. There are other quantitative metrics and great corollaries in an application. A student who has a great SAT score is going to have certain other things 98% of the time, right? They're going to have a couple of AP scores, or they're going to have done the other thing that looks really excellent from a quantitative piece. So even in removing the number, I would surmise that most experienced admissions officers, without the test score, looking at everything else in the application, could probably guess with great accuracy what the test score actually was anyway, right?
Interesting.
So the application is vast enough in that sense to catch a couple of different quantitative excellences in that way.
What was your advice to students when all of these schools started going test optional? And so then you have the bind of like, if I submit it, it might hurt me or it might help me. But if I don't, is it going to hurt me or is it going to help me? Like, how did you help students think through that calculus?
Yeah, great question. There are certain numbers that I would use, So for the for the SAT, if I'm working as a private counselor, and a student hits a certain number, I say we submit that number.
Did it have to be like perfect or just a few points off from perfect?
Yeah,
okay.
Pretty close to perfect. And we submit,
Otherwise, don't bother.
Otherwise, don't bother. Yeah. Or again, I also use the rule of quantitative excellence. So if you're not submitting any AP scores or if your GPA is not excellent, we have to submit a high test score or we have to retake the SAT or ACT because you have zero quantitative excellences here. So let's make sure that someone can acknowledge you're one.
We're talking, though, about highly selective universities, of which there are a relative handful in the country. So is this a lot of focus placed on like a relatively small thing when we think about higher education in the country overall? Or do you think it really matters that we spend a lot of time thinking and focusing on who gets into the most selective schools.
Yeah, I mean, as long as there's this level of energy towards 25, 30 very selective schools, it's also going to be this advantage for the students who graduate from those places, right? Those are inextricably linked. Do I think the focus is incorrectly placed on 25, 30 schools? Absolutely. I don't see that changing in the American mind anytime soon. I think inherently folks can name those 25, 30 schools and kind of forget about the thousands of others pretty quickly. As long as that advantage exists, then the folks who are admitted to that should at best represent, equitable desire, I think among the folks who are applying, if that makes sense.
Alex, thank you so much for taking time for sharing your insights today.
Truly my pleasure, Julie.
Alex Coupe worked in admissions at Stanford and at the University of Chicago. During the recent shift to test-optional admissions, he was the lead college counselor for Empowerly, which is a private admissions coaching company. Now, up to this point, we've been talking mostly about private elite universities. But the question of who deserves to get into college and how hangs heavier over public universities that are funded by tax dollars. So, to understand what the shift away from tests and affirmative action might mean for higher education more broadly, let's take a look at the University of California. Two of the most selective public universities in the country are UCLA and UC Berkeley. The University of California system has been operating without affirmative action since the mid-1990s. And that's when voters banned the use of race in public college admissions. And more recently, the University of California led out in eliminating the test requirement. UC schools are now test blind, meaning admissions officers don't look at SAT or ACT scores at all.
We had a substantial spike in applications from underrepresented students, from students of color. So taking away the test, I think, really made students believe that they could be more competitive than they felt they were before.
Patricia Gandara is a longtime professor in UCLA's Graduate School of Education, and she's co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. She was an early proponent of removing the test requirement, even before the COVID pandemic forced the move.
I've dealt with this issue through my whole career, really, and students were really traumatized by the idea of having to do a test that they knew their group did not do well on. I mean, this is very well known that African American and Latino students don't score as well as Asian students and white students. And I am very convinced that a lot of students who could do well at the most selective institutions take themselves out of the game because they view that it's not for them.
Gandara hopes eliminating the test requirement will accelerate the University of California's progress in racial diversity. After voters banned affirmative action back in 1996, Black and Hispanic student enrollment at the top UC schools plunged by 40%. Those numbers stayed low until around 2010. In 2023, the UC system admitted its most diverse class ever, with 5% Black and 28% Hispanic students. Both rates have doubled in the past 20 years. Though Gandara notes the University of California has yet to reach parity for Hispanic students, who are half of all public K-12 students in the state, but only a quarter of UC enrollment. Still, she says, the trend is positive.
Part of it is that the university has done a rather remarkable job in outreach to communities, but it's taken 25 years. Our first efforts went towards building some programs that would help these students starting from high school to be prepared. And I was the evaluator for one, which was Puente, which is a program that focused on Latino students. We saw that that made a difference, but in a state the size of California, it was a drop in the bucket. I mean, these programs were never going to get us there.
She says holistic review of applicants also made a difference.
And that meant that we looked at things besides grades and test scores, challenges that students had overcome, abilities that they had. What ended up being 14 factors. And one of those was the SAT. So when the SAT was dropped, it became 13 factors. That has helped a lot. In that way, it has been possible to look at students who have overcome tremendous challenges, who have gone to schools that we know did not prepare them with the right courses or didn't offer so many AP courses, but the students took advantage of what was there. I think that's made the biggest difference. Although I point out again, I mean, we still are not anywhere near the point where we have any kind of parity with the students who are actually graduating from our high schools.
Does it matter so much, though, that those individuals go to a selective school, like an Ivy League school, or in California, UCLA, UC Berkeley? There are other programs that are less selective that they could also get a degree from.
Let me give you a rough statistic. If they go to a state university, which is more selective, but less selective than the University of California, the chances are around 50% that they'll actually get a degree. If they go to the University of California, the chances are about 85% that they'll get a degree. So yeah, it matters a lot. It matters how selective the institution is in terms of the resources that they have, the peer group that is there, the opportunities. It matters a lot if you want to get a degree.
Now, since much of Gandhara's work focuses on increasing access to the UC system to a more diverse group of students, I was intrigued at a subtle shift that she introduced to our conversation about who deserves these most valuable degrees.
I think that we need to be more focused on what the university education can do for the community, for a state, for a people. The People's University should be more concerned about how students contribute to the well-being of the state and less so on the students' own personal success. That's not to say we don't want our students to be successful, but I think it's important for a university that is a state university that is supported by the state and for the state, that the students who are admitted have some concern about how they're going to contribute. There was a wonderful study done, about 20 years ago by Derek Bach called The Shape of the River. They looked at those who had been admitted through affirmative action, and one of the things that they found was that those young people who had gotten a chance through an affirmative action entry had gone on to do much more community service. There was a kind of sense that I got a chance and now I got to bring other people up. I like that. I like the idea that we admit students who are going to make the world a little better for others besides just themselves. Being a musician, being an artist, those are wonderful things in our society. Those are things that we would like to support and help mold. People who have a goal of running a nonprofit to help the homeless and still are going to school and taking all their courses and doing that. I think these are important things for us to consider in who makes up a class. I like for my own children to be influenced by being around, rubbing shoulders with young people like this.
So it's less about who deserves the college education and more about who can do the most for us with that college education.
What contributions do students have to make? And how have they realized those contributions? Yeah.
Patricia Gandhara is a professor in the Graduate School of Education at UCLA and co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. What's your college admission story? I'd love to hear it. Did anything in today's episode challenge your point of view? Email your thoughts to topofmind@byu.edu. And be sure to check out our companion podcast, Uncomfy, where people tell us their own stories of choosing to stay curious and stick with the discomfort of a challenging perspective or situation. You can watch Uncomfy on YouTube, Spotify, and the BYU Radio app. Top of Mind is a BYU Radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman, Elena Beck, and James Hoops, with help from Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Gabe Vargas, Kelsey Ney, and Brendan Lewis. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.